Today we are approaching the end of week 10 of patch 10.2.5 of Dragonflight, and we are on our weekly Mythic Plus recap for this reset. Now, we have gone a couple of days ago on the record on what were the balance tuning changes having as an effect in the results of the specs. We were pointing out, looking at the damage at the time, that many, actually all, of the specs that got buffed were having a significant growth, especially in Mythic Plus. So now that we are looking at the updated picture of this week, of this fortified, sanguine and incorporeal week, which is not a very engaged week. Some players, quite a few players, are taking a week off. Maybe they're going down, playing some lower level alts, for example, rather than trying to push during this week. However, the results are still coming in, and we have some of the first surprises for the first time in a while. For example, that temporarily, at the very least at the moment, RET Paladin is ahead of Havoc Demon Hunter in overall damage in keys, in the top level keys of this week. For the first time in basically the entire season, because if we go back to the start of this season, the week 1 of this patch, Havoc was clearly easily the best one. Even if we go a couple of weeks later, Havoc was still there. A couple of weeks later, it's still Havoc. In the meantime, RET is starting to grow. RET is still there. RET goes down a bit, only to then go up after the buffs of this week 10 of this patch, and they are currently first by just a tiny bit. Now, we've also mentioned, again, very quickly, that a few other specs were also buffed over the past month or so. For example, Windwalker was buffed, Arms was buffed, Survival was buffed, Shadow, Unholy, and also probably we shouldn't forget Fire Mage, which right now is looking terrible, but even up to last week, Fire Mage was doing much better. If we go back a month ago, Fire was doing not nearly as well, Arms was not doing nearly as well, Shadow was at the bottom, Feral was at the bottom, Arms was towards the bottom, Survival was bottom half, and same goes for Windwalker, bottom half. If you go up to today, now these specs are all in the top half, with the exception of Feral, just slightly below. You can even see here from the week-to-week changes in ranks the results of the buffs. Big number increases for Feral, Unholy, Shadow, etc., and then RET being the highest one, taking a spot away from Havoc. The main difference is that this is taking on more average results throughout the season rather than the weekly results of this list, which is only tracking the current highest keys. Similar gaps and results can still be found in other specs being buffed. As a reminder, not just DPS got buffed this week, it was also Holy Priest in terms of damage, and also Resto Shaman in terms of damage. So their numbers now are on par with Preservation and Restoration Druid, while still being significantly gapped by Discipline and Mistweaver. Now, talking about the results, as usual, it's always worth pointing out that the gap in these results does not actually translate to the absolute highest level of keys. Even if it did, even if this were true, it would take a while for these range of keys to adapt to the meta, because these are all players in the same team, in the same group, running together at all times, which makes it much harder for them to just swap to a different class, to a different spec, to start playing something else. It's not that a Havoc Demon Hunter can just say, oh, I am getting out DPS'd by a RET Paladin by 3000 DPS, I better reroll and start pushing 31 keys on a RET Paladin, right? So that's not actually happening in the super high level of keys. Even if a RET Paladin has been buffed and is doing much more, it's not that you will see any RET Paladins in here, for example. Same can be said for Mage, to be honest. Most of these will be for Fire Mage over Frost. And even if we go here, it's not that Fire Mage is topping the damage meters. Even after the buffs, where Fire Mage grew a lot compared to the early part of the season, they went up and up, buff after buff. Even in their better positions, they were still getting beat by Beast Mastery, by RET after the buffs, by Demo, by Outlaw, by Havoc. But if you go here, it's not that you see many rogues being above mages, for example. It's not that you see any hunters being above mages in the very high level of keys. So that's the first thing worth reminding everyone, that the results of the meta at large by thousands and thousands of keys across the high-ish level of results. Plus 26, 27, 28 is not exactly the same as the very highest level of keys at the moment. And as pointed out, even if it is true, then it will still take time for these groups to adapt their composition if they think something is better, if they think they want to swap something. If you look at the results here, for the very highest level of keys, there is only 523 specs in this level, right? 523. These results are in the 8,000 runs per spec, 8, 6, 6,000, 4,000. So that's how many more are logged in here compared to the very, very few that are running the highest level of keys. That's the other thing worth pointing out. So the damage increase is visible. Now, the other question is, with these specs doing more damage, clearly, is this being shown in the popularity? So are players actually noticing this damage to the point where they go back and start playing these specs more? Like maybe some prot paladins trying out RET because RET is strong now, maybe some RET paladins that weren't doing Mythic Plus or stopped doing Mythic Plus a while ago trying to push again because the spec is now buffed and doing more damage, etc, etc. So if we were to move to the meta, we also do see positive changes for many of the buffed specs. Obviously, the biggest change in here, you can see it quite clearly, is the ping. The ping of Red Paladin, which becomes much bigger. It's one of the biggest growths we have seen over time, where in just 2 weeks, they went from 4% of all DPS in top keys to 16% at the moment, which is 4 times as much. Even Fire Mage, even Fire Mage after getting buffed in a couple of weeks increased by about 3 times as much. Not even as much as Red Paladin did. So it's definitely the biggest growth in a couple of weeks from prior to the buff to after the buff that we have seen, even possibly this entire expansion. If we exclude, obviously, the massive growth of Augmentation after the introduction into the game, there is no other spec that within a couple of weeks gained that much from the start of the expansion. Resto Shaman got close after the few changes towards the end of Season 1, which made them much stronger. Besides that, most of the other specs are falling behind the growth of RET in this patch. You can still see other growths here and there. We also touched on this a couple of days ago. We are starting to see the growth, the tiny growth of arms in popularity after their damage has grown after being buffed. We have started to see more Shadow Priest, now that Shadow Priest's damage has become at least not terrible. For example, same goes for Holy Priest, now showing up, at least their number is visible compared to the rest of this season, and same goes for Resto Shaman. So those are visible additions to the presence in Mythic Plus of all of these buffed specs. What is perhaps also visible, and this is not positive, because for now we have talked about something positive. We have pointed out how more diverse the DPS part of the meta is getting, and even the healer meta, which we said already was the most diverse sets of meta for healers of the entire expansion. In terms of options, in terms of amount of different specs in high keys, the bad part of today is tanks, because tanks are sort of regressing to a more dominant phase of Vengeance, right? You see Vengeance started strong and then started being legitimately contested by Prot Paladin, right? It was a legitimate 50-50 for over a month, and then it wasn't. And then Vengeance started growing significantly more, with Prot Paladin losing more and more. And now, even after the buffs to multiple tanks, including Blood, now Prot Paladin has gotten even smaller than before. That's perhaps the bad part of these changes, the fact that some of the less popular tanks being buffed, so Guardian Druid a while ago and now Blood DK and even Prot Warrior, they are now more present, they are now more visible than before. The problem is they haven't taken space away from Vengeance, which was the dominant tank. They have taken space away from Prot Paladin, which was the second dominant tank. So now the result is that the number of Vengeance is even bigger than before. You can even see it if we go back to the top keys, now there are more and more closer to the top, more and more Vengeance Demon Hunters and fewer of the other tanks, especially Prot Paladin, which used to be more contested before, right? If we go back to the tank only and we start getting into the high key range of 30, now Vengeance is in the 70% range, and in the 25 plus, Vengeance is still actually doubling, more than doubling the presence of Prot Paladin, when it was tighter, it was closer a few weeks ago. So that is perhaps one of the negatives of the buffs brought by this week. The DPS specs are getting more varied, the healers are getting more varied, the tanks are not at the moment in Mythic Plus. If there is another, though, bigger silver lining to this result is Augmentation Evoker. To the party, to the gang of the community which cannot stand augmentation, doesn't like the spec, how it works, how unhealthy it is for the game, or just very simply because you believe that the majority of Augmentation Evoker are terrible players who have gotten boosted, who have gotten carried by the fact that it is hard to gauge the performance of an Augmentation Evoker compared to a standard DPS, so you never quite know if the augmentation was doing sick damage and carrying the key, or if it was being terrible and just being a dead weight in your group. You can much more clearly see if a Fire Mage or an Auto Rogue are blasting in your key compared to an Augmentation Evoker. So it is nice to see that for once Augmentation has been dropping in popularity at the very least. If we had to go by since their implementation in the game, in the entirety of Season 2, Augmentation has always been the most played DPS. Even above Shadow and Fire, Augmentation was number 1. And then Augmentation was never below the second to third for a few weeks in terms of popularity. You can see from the start, they were only behind Havoc, they then kept slightly behind Havoc, here they slightly started passing Havoc, but then Fire Mage was being buffed, and then they were being passed by Fire Mage, but on average, they were still either second or third. So, at any point since the introduction of this spec, they have never been outside of the top 3 of the DPS picks in Mythic Plus. This week, for now, they are outside. This week, for now, they are behind Fire, they are behind Havoc, they are behind Outlaw, and they are behind Red Paladin. So they are 5th at the moment, which is their worst result since their introduction in the game. Which is, as I said, a reason to rejoice for everyone who cannot stand Augmentation and hopes this will be a sign for the future to get this spec out of the meta. Now, talking about meta and talking about future, what also happened this week to finish wasn't just buffing some specs, it was also nerfing the hardest dungeon of the season, which is Muruzond's Rise. So, have the changes of Muruzond's Rise actually contributed to making the dungeon a more easily completable one? The answer at the moment is yes. The answer is that now it's Throne of the Tides, which has moved down to be the hardest dungeon of the season. If we go back by even just a few weeks, another fortified week, for example, of a couple of weeks ago, Muruzond's Rise was comfortably almost 20% behind Throne of the Tides in terms of completion chance before getting nerfed, and now in this latest week they are now gotten past it and trying to bridge the gap with Everbloom. So good to know that the changes had the intended effect to Muruzond's Rise in making it a more manageable key. Obviously now the eyes are going to be on other annoying mechanics and dangerous in their scaling mechanics in Mythic Plus. There are still quite a few of them. For example, the one in Throne of the Tides being several mechanics of some of the bosses in high tyrannical keys, and we are not even on a tyrannical week right now. Those are still something that might be worth a look at from Blizzard. You know, take it easy. We are only almost 3 months into the season. You know, don't rush nerfing annoying mechanics. No hurries, of course. Please take it easy. Then we have the finish of the week with the compositions of Mythic Plus, just to iterate even more the higher presence of Red Paladin, as we have already talked about, as well as the disappearance, not full disappearance of course, but the slight disappearance and loss of popularity of Augmentation. Because if we go back to over a month ago, Augmentation was a staple pick. Fire Mage, as it was about to be buffed, started to become a more and more prevalent pick in Mythic Plus, and Havoc was also a staple pick. Then we go over to today, and Augmentation is losing out a lot more. Fire Mage has solidified itself post buffs to be a standard pick in top keys, and then now Ret Paladin as well, which over the past couple of weeks have gotten more and more representation. It's like more and more players are waking up to the power of Ret Paladin, or very simply, perhaps there are so many Ret Paladin players, as we can see from the popularity of the spec. Even when you start going at all levels, Ret is the most popular spec alongside Havoc, so it's just a sheer number of Ret players trying to get into these keys. This is how we are finding the updated Week 10 recap of Mythic Plus, as we continue to monitor the supposed growth of many of these specs which have received buffs in this week, with the biggest one, of course, the biggest highlight being at the moment Ret Paladin, the one having the better results out of all the other specs being buffed. So for the beginning of this week, Monday, and the almost end of the reset in WoW, we are now leaving each other after the recap of Mythic Plus for today. We are starting as usual the goodbyes by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help. You can go to the channel, which can as usual still be given completely for free, starting by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, a bit too long, honestly. I was hoping to stay closer to like 13 to 14 minutes. This dragged on a bit too much, as usual.